So here we are in North America, and it seems like we're in a bit of a pickle. Donald Trump and his tech billionaire bros have taken over the United States and have effectively declared war on some of his allies, including a tariff war on Canada and Mexico, and threatening to perhaps take over Canada or Denmark. While that would be bad enough, and bad is an understatement here, what makes the situation critical is that Canada has its own Trump wannabe, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. Canada is literally facing an upcoming battle for our collective future. And to ensure that our most basic human rights and environmental protections are not rolled back to the Ice Age. So naturally, I reached out to NDP MP Charlie Angus to talk about these challenges and what we can do about it. Charlie, for those of you who don't know, has been an NDP MP for Timmins, Ontario for 20 years. During that time, we've seen him stand against injustices of all kinds. He's won every award there is to win, and not because he led a Fortune 500 company, but because he cares about people. We've seen him advocate for a national suicide prevention strategy, push for a papal apology for Indian residential schools abuses, support Cindy Blackstock and the First Nation Child and Family Caring Society to get justice for First Nation kids in foster care, and stand on the front lines protecting lands and waters hand in hand with Indigenous peoples and environmental groups. And on a personal level, he's supported my advocacy and key legislative initiatives advanced by Indigenous peoples all over Canada, like ending sex discrimination in the Indian Act and the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP. One of the things I appreciate most about him is that he's down to earth. He knows what it means to work hard, having worked as a chimney sweep and a dishwasher. He even founded a punk rock band. And he's also written books about critical issues, though I don't know where he finds the time. Some of his books include Dangerous Memory, Coming of Age in a Decade of Greed, Cobalt, Cradle of the Demon Metals, Birth of a Mining Superpower, and Children of the Broken Treaty, Canada's Lost Promise and One Girl's Dream. Given his recent announcement that he will not be running in the next election, I needed to get his take on where we are and what we can do to not become the 51st U.S. state or go anywhere in the same direction as Donald Trump and his tech billionaire broligarchs. Hi, my name is Pam Palmater, and I am the host of the Warrior Brief podcast. I was inspired by Charlie, and I hope you will be too. Okay, Charlie, thanks again for being here. I am so honored to be able to work with you on anything, but to have you come on my podcast is a real honor. Now, one of the things, like 20 years of being the NDP MP for Timmins, Ontario, you've announced that you won't be seeking re-election. That's a long time to hold political office. Can you share a little bit about your time in political office, kind of like the good, the bad, and maybe some of the ugly?
Oh, well, thanks so much. Being an elected member of parliament was not on my bingo card. I didn't even own a suit at the start of the 2004 election. Jack Layton convinced me to run. I'd been in music, in the punk movement with the Grievous Angels. My wife and I moved to a little mining town in Northern Ontario. We tried to run a publication. I was doing freelance media work. And then I got caught up in fighting the Adams Mine garbage dump, which was the biggest environmental battle at that time, and PCBs. And I realized I was good at organizing, and I realized I was good at confrontation, something I didn't think I was good at. So we ran in 2004 and have held the seat ever since. So, I mean, what's been great are the people, being in the communities, getting to know them. I've seen some real dismal and dark times. Certainly, the Attawapiskat housing crisis is a really dark moment in terms of the racism and the hate. But I've also seen incredible transformation happening, particularly in what's happening in Indigenous communities. So that's been a great thing to be a witness to. But I mean, 20 years, we could go on for it. I mean, there's been so many things I've been involved in. So let's just skip to the next question.
Well, surely there must have been some really, really difficult times, especially on the Indigenous front, because I've known you at times, like I know you represent the Timmins, Ontario area, but your advocacy on Indigenous issues has gone beyond that. Like you've advocated on the national stage in solidarity with Idle No More, with Indigenous women and girls, with other Indigenous activists on a wide range of things. What made you so passionate about Indigenous issues that, I mean, you were speaking truth to power, you were out there, you didn't mince words, you were saying we've got to do better?
I think the issue is that sometimes, as an outsider, being able to speak the mass to speak to the massive trauma, which is much harder than I think than communities who've lived it. I was raised by my grandmothers. They had intense Scottish oral memory, and they knew their history, and they knew about the taking away of the land, and they told me stories about the famine. So this was a sense of duty. My grannies told me, like, you have an obligation to remember, and that was always this thing about remember and to tell. When I was first elected, I flew into Saskatchewan, and I was astounded by the squalid conditions people were living in. And I remember Rebecca Friday walking up, and she said to me, "So you're the member of parliament, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "How would you like to raise your kids in a prisoner of war camp?" And suddenly I realized that that's what the Northern Reserves were. They were about taking the people from their own lands and putting them in these squalid little areas. Right after that, I was involved in the Saskatchewan water crisis, and the indifference at the time, it seemed normal that Health Canada would casually tell you in the middle of an E. coli crisis to wash your children in E. coli contaminated water, as long as you boiled it first. This is just after Walkerton. Certainly the biggest, I think, influence for me was the youth of Attawapiskat. Meeting Shannon Kostasian when she was in grade 8 changed my life. It changed my life for the better and made me realize that these weren't theoretical issues. It wasn't good enough to talk about it. People's lives were on the line, and young people's lives were on the line, and children only have one childhood, and once it's gone forever. So that fire that I got from Shannon, I felt that was my duty to carry that through.
And who would have known at the time when you first met her that we would lose her at such a young age, yet in her years, she was such a powerful advocate thrown into, the wolf den, so to speak, of politics and people who sometimes hold racist views. And during the Harper era, there wasn't always a very nice government to have to deal with, yet you stood beside her. And I'm sure that throughout these years, standing, whether it's with Chief Teresa Spence during Idle No More, Shannon Kostasian, any of the groups, Attawapiskat, Saskatchewan, any of them, you must have had some pushback from some elements in the public. How did you deal with that?
There were days when I knew that the racist stuff was going to start blasting. I used to tell my staff, batten down the hatches, we're going through a storm, but we're not stopping. I remember being at coffee shops and people would go, all you do is help the goddamn Indians, blah, blah. And I said, hey, if your children didn't have a school, I'd fight like hell for your children. If your children had dirty water, I'd fight like hell for your children. And I saw a change, and I saw that kind of race hatred was transformed. But and I think Canada is in a better place now. We're just not where we need to be, and we need to keep going. But when I saw the conditions that children in Attawapiskat were being educated in, it was unbelievable to me. And I remember Shannon coming up to me at 13 and looking me in the eye, and she said, "The little brothers and sisters are going to get a school. I'm going to make sure of it." She looked me right in the eye, and I was like, "Who is this girl?" She lived with my family for a year because she couldn't get high school education. So just before her accident, she was living with us, and then she had moved to a neighboring home. But I know I'm going to digress, but I met an old union organizer, Bob Carlin, who was one of my heroes. He was 90 years old. I didn't know who he was at the time. He organized the Western Federation of Miners. He was back in the cobalt mine strikes. He was a labor leader who had fought the fights. And he said to me that you'll see certain people who have that look in their eye, and they change everything. When you see that look, follow them. And I always was struck by that. And when I saw Shannon, I saw that look, and that's what she had. So between the age of 13 and 15, she changed Canada. There were moments with Shannon where literally I suddenly thought, there's no going back from here. Like when she stood on Parliament Hill and called out the government, she became the face of a generation that up to then had just not had that face. Now there are many faces out there. So that's her legacy, I think, what she inspired other young people to do. And we needed young heroes like that. And that's one thing I felt as a bit of an elder, that we couldn't let her death just pass. We needed young people to look to her and say, I can do it too. And I've met so many young people who've been inspired by her because of that.
Oh my goodness, she inspired so many movements. You've got all of these young girls on the front lines to end murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, young Indigenous women fighting against climate action, like literally following in the footsteps of the matriarchs, but also other Indigenous activists. And we won't ever forget her. She's literally at the center of the kinds of people that we celebrate. Hey friends, Pam Palmater here. I hope you're enjoying this episode of the Warrior Brief podcast. My mission is to offer critical, fact-based analysis of political, legal, and social issues that are facing Canadians from an Indigenous perspective. I'm not a member of, nor do I work for or campaign for any political party at any level of government. And I do that because I want to be able to consider what everybody has to say on a wide variety of perspectives, and then really do my analysis based on that. My hot takes on issues are based on the best facts, stats, and research available at the time. And remember, the Warrior Brief Substack and podcast is only possible with your subscriptions and support. And I think you'll find an inspiring group of family, friends, allies, and supporters, as well as fellow advocates, activists, and analysts here at the Warrior Brief. Thanks so much for your support, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. One of the things I wanted to ask you is, like any community, Indigenous peoples are different across the country. First Nations have their own politics. But I've noticed that anytime anyone's ever reached out to you for help, whether it's me or any other Indigenous activist, you don't put politics first. You just say, yeah, sure, what can I do? Like, what about that? Do you ever get any blowback from the fact that, oh, look, you're standing with an environmentalist, or look, you're standing with a land defender, or someone like Cindy Blackstock who's advocating against kids in care? You just say yes, like almost instantaneously.
Well, this is where the fight's been, and you always have to be on the right side of history. You need to step up. I was 37 years old the first time I ever stepped on a reserve. Like, I didn't know anything. I learned incredible lessons. I learned from the Algonquin Nation during the Adams mine fight. I went to work in Barrier Lake. We were doing blockades. I was a blockade organizer back then. And in the La Vérendrye Park, and stopping hydro projects. and realizing things could be better. And I thought if I went to Ottawa, I could make that difference. And realizing at first my naivety about Indian affairs, and then realizing it's not broken. It was built that way.
Yeah.
And we had to take that apart. So, I do what I can, and I
Mm.
be where I can be, and sometimes it's about shining that light and being that voice, of being supported. I don't know how
Yeah.
many years I spent with the St. Anne's residential school survivors. Once you see something that is that wrong, how do you walk away from it? And I'll divert just a second, but after
Yeah.
the first time when I started working with Edmund Matatawaban and the St. Anne's survivors, like I'd heard about St. Anne's, um,
Mhm.
but I didn't know what a dark shadow it was. Now I can see that shadow in the face of people. I can see the trauma. You look at where the suicide crises have been in our northern communities, and you can overlay it right community for community where the trauma and abuse happened in that previous generation. So working with St. Anne's to me was like this is our responsibility. The survivors shouldn't have to be stepping up. They did nothing wrong. Canada did wrong. But again, I do. It's the one area I'm very hopeful for. I see the incredible
Mhm.
change. When I got elected, I was being interviewed on the TV all the time about Indigenous issues because TV didn't know who to talk to. I'm hardly ever asked to talk now, and I'm thinking that's awesome because the voices, as you pointed out, have taken this up, and particularly the young. I go to the rallies just to watch, just to see changes happening, and it's going to make us a better place for this.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've always admired about you. If there is an Indigenous rally, a union rally, an environmental rally, anything that relates to things that are human rights, planetary protections, you're going to be there. And the way you've just supported unions has also been so important because unions have supported us. We have this
Hmm.
really good relationship where we care about the basics of social justice. We may not agree on everything, but social justice seems to be at the heart of unions. Is that what you found working with unions?
Well, I come out of hard rock mining country.
Mhm.
My grandmother was a mining widow. Um, our communities, the graveyards of Timmins, are full of immigrants who died in their early 40s from the silicosis and the lung cancers. There's not a family I know that hasn't been affected by mine accidents. So that's the history that I know. And I met some incredible people through the years who fought those fights. So that to me is, I've never actually been in a union. I've always sort of just been on the margins doing my thing. But that fight for labor, that fight for justice, that fight to build a better and more inclusive Canada is not just something that I've been inspired by, but we cannot let grifters and oligarchs take that away from us. So it means the fights are coming back, and we got to tool up for it, because our previous generations, they fought like hell to get what we have, and we cannot betray that trust and the gift that they gave us to live a better life.
Speaking of which, it seems almost surreal that any of these things would be up for negotiation, that workers' protection or wages or women's rights, Indigenous rights, like any of these things, you think how long it took. These are long, hard fought battles to win and protect and assert. And now it seems like with an election, Donald Trump just has the executive order ability to just sign all of that stuff away. And then you have mini Trump, who I consider Pierre Poilievre to be aspiring to be like Trump, who seems to be giving very strong signals that he would go down that same boat. How concerned are you, A, about what's happening in the US and the potential impacts for Canadians, but B, that we have a mini Trump brewing in our own territory?
Well, the politics of disinformation and hatred have been bubbling in Canada for a long time. It's been bubbling
Yeah.
underneath the surface. We see it. I mean, the amount of death threats I get has become normalized. It's not normal. The threats we see against young women and racialized public figures, this is not normal. The right have become emboldened, and we see now with the gangster from Mar-a-Lago, the attacks on women's rights, the attacks on the marginalized, the attacks on racialized people, and the attacks on the international democratic order that it cost so many thousands and millions of lives to put in place. This is a menace, and we have to treat it as a serious threat. I feel at this point in my life, if there's anything I can do, it's going to be to push back against that rise of fascism, because that's what it is. And Pierre Poilievre is a man fundamentally unfit for public office. The people that he's put around him are unfit for public office. The chasing of the rage algorithm is the death of democracy, and we have to find a way to dial that back, to push that back, and to take back our communities, to take back our democracy. And maybe the one thing that Donald Trump has done for us is made us realize we can't keep sleepwalking and hoping for the best. It comes down to each of us are going to make choices, and that's what I'm hearing from people across the country. You know, my mother's cousin in her 80s called me the other day. I hadn't spoken to her since I was a little boy, and she said, "What do I need to do? I'll be part of the resistance." These are people who see our nation as being threatened, but what they're not seeing are political leaders standing up for them. So if I can do anything at this time, is to speak up against that threat and to say, not on my watch, not on our watch, not ever.
Well, and how important is it that we all come together? We don't have to agree on everything. We can kind of set all different religions aside and different political spectrums aside and personal issues. How important is it that people from all backgrounds come together and make sure that A, we don't elect a Trump, and B, that we actually pay attention to what's happening in the US? Because I think in his first term, too many people were saying, oh, he's just an idiot, or that's nothing, it's not going to impact us, or, people just kind of dismissed him as if he didn't have the power to make these changes. Certainly you must see that unity is going to be key moving forward.
The issue of unity is really important at this time. I think one of the failings of the left recently is, many times it seems like we'd rather be pure than make a difference. I'd rather be messy. I'll reach out to anybody who's concerned right now. And I think sometimes the left gets caught up in word game politics and who should be sitting where at the table. Fuck that. We're dealing with fascists right now. So I think it's the big tent. And there's going to be a lot of people coming into that tent who maybe weren't in our tent before. And it's the reason I come from these politics, because when we fought the Adams Mine garbage dump, which was a vicious, dark fight that took, I don't know how many years of my life, we built this big tent approach. We realized we had a lot of people who never spoke to each other, people who didn't trust each other. We had rural francophone and then, evangelical, Pentecostal, Anglophone farmers, and none of them had ever spoken with the Indigenous communities. And they thought if we went over to the Indigenous communities, the Indigenous community would start claiming land. And then we had urban environmentalists. And then we realized what was at stake was our region, and our kids' future, and the sanctity of our water, which was on. And once we all came together, we were unbeatable, and alliances were made then that have never been broken in my region. And that to me was always the lesson. It's like we can bring people across so many different views to say, what do you cherish? Do you cherish our nation as it is and could be better? Yeah, there's tons of problems in Canada, but do you look at the United States and say that that's the option? Do you see what Putin's doing? Do you think that that's an option? No. So I'm not optimistic, but I'm super hopeful. I know that might sound strange, but optimism, I think fools are optimistic. Hope is rooted in belief that we can actually make a difference. And I feel that at this time, but man, the odds are stacked. So we're just going to have to get to work.
Well, and I think, you've shown that we can do that. We can come together. I think of New Brunswick, and Elsa Bukduk was fighting against the hydrofracking trucks and the hundreds of RCMP there, arresting them. And how many, at the end of the day, it was New Brunswickers who were standing by the hundreds beside Elsa Booktook and voted out that government. Like, they had the numbers and the power to do that. And they did that. Like, no one ever would have expected that would happen. And we can see those kinds of examples across the country. So I feel like nationally, yeah, I can sit in a room with someone I totally don't agree with on a whole bunch of files. But when it comes to protecting women's rights and labor and jobs and the environment and indigenous peoples, like, yeah, okay, I can do that. I feel like there's enough of us that can see, we've got a war right now. Let's come together
Yep.
for the
Yep.
war. We can agree to go back to our little, groups afterwards, so long as we're ready to face that head on. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because you've been calling this out for a long time, long before the media started saying, hey, wait, maybe we have a tech billionaire giant problem here. You've been very concerned and active on the online misinformation, foreign election interference, the control by tech giants about what we see and what we don't see and what's in the media. Um, what made you so early on? I think before many other people saw this as a problem, they were saying, like, what are you talking about? There's no problem. Um, I think the United States has shown, oh my goodness, how quickly a few tech giants can actually control not just an election, but now control the power in a country. What made you see that so early on?
Well, I am a recovering digital utopian. Um, I believed in the mid 80s that this was a tool for radical democracy. This was going to bring us together. This was our way of taking on the power. And in the early years, it seemed like so much was that we couldn't have even imagined before it became possible. And uh, I really went in when I was first elected. I went in supporting the idea of opening up the internet. I think I was probably played by the masterminds at Google because I was naive, but I believed these were tools for democratic change. But what we realize is that hate and disinformation moves a lot quicker in a 140 character universe than truth and relationships. And I was certainly really involved in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, starting to understand the dark powers of Facebook, but also how our lives have become increasingly rewired and we become increasingly isolated. And right now, after COVID, the darkness that has descended, where people that we all know who were nice, straightforward, good people who went into dark places and haven't come back out, that's the rewiring of our brains. And right now with Elon Musk, a freaking fascist who controls the world's largest platform, seemingly getting away with it. This is the greatest threat. It's not just a threat to democracy, it's a threat to human civilization. And I say that because we have become increasingly isolated from one another. We need to start going back to in-person events. We need to start organizing together. I want to tell all my activist friends, you are not going to change the world with a Zoom revolution. Get sitting there at 7 o'clock at night in your jammies and all agreeing to a plan. What changes the world are those dirty, messy meetings where you end up talking to someone who's like been a loudmouth at the meeting, and then afterwards you have a coffee or a beer and you realize, okay, maybe we can work together. We've lost the personal, and the personal is essential in maintaining community and in maintaining our lives. So I'm urging people to get out there, to start volunteering, doing anything, but do not let your brain be wired by the tech bros.
Yeah, or let it happen to your kids, because if there's one thing we
Yes.
can learn from history, like I think of all of the native protests after the 1969 white paper on Indian policy, there were no cell phones, there was
Mm-hmm.
no
Yep.
internet and social media. At best, we were calling each other, faxing each other, and meeting in large groups and traveling stuffed in vans with bologna sandwiches, saying, okay, we got to do something. We don't know what, but let's come together. And you know what? That helped for the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the indigenous movement. And somehow we managed to do that with no money, no like big political power, but coming together, we did it. And Charlie, I'm so inspired by you, and I'm so thankful for all the support you've given me on the issues I've asked you to speak to. I see you out there supporting all the people I consider heroes: Ellen Gabriel, Sharon
Hmm.
MacGyver, Cindy
Yeah.
Blackstock, all of these people. Um, I know that this has taken a huge, I mean, it always takes a huge personal toll. Politics. I saw your quote about shedding the snake skin, in terms of retirement. But I have a sneaky suspicion that this isn't the end for you, that you're probably going to keep advocating and educating and bringing people together. Am I right about that?
This is definitely a new beginning. Um, I mean, it's been an honor to be in politics, but my new constituency, which is 20,000 kilometers bigger than it was, and it's already bigger than the UK, I wouldn't be doing this right now. I'd be in the car driving to communities I've never been to before, spread out over a vast amount of highways. I can't do politics unless it's local. I wouldn't be
Mm.
able to be focused on the Trump threats and that. And I realized that there's a moment, and I always knew there would be a moment when I was going back to Northern Ontario, but I think I'm going
Mm.
back now to the kind of activism and a freedom to do that activism. I don't know what else I do. I mean, I got a whole bunch of drywall projects for my daughter that I have to do, and I'm doing some research on a new book, and my band is back on the road. But the revolution is here, and all of us play a part in it. And I've been honored to have seen how change happens and
Yeah.
know
Yeah.
that what looks like monolithic power starts to disintegrate when enough people come together and are not afraid. So I'll be
Yeah.
there. I don't know what I'm going to be doing, but I'll be there.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And I'll make sure to post links because you're on Substack now, which I just saw, which is fantastic, writing about this resistance and coming together. And I'll post links to your books and, of course, your music and things like that. But any place where you are, I'll post links so that people know where to find you and can keep track of what you're doing and your calls for actions or coffees in a donut shop or rallying and organizing. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, Charlie, for
Well, thank
taking
you
the
for
time.
having me. And thank you for the work that you've done fearlessly. And so I'm now Charlie Angus, the Resistance. I don't know what that means yet, but I got a lot of people signing up and saying, let's be the Resistance. So
Yeah.
the Resistance is coming. We'll figure it out as we go. Like I said, life's messy. It's way better when it's messy. It's going to be ups and downs. There's going to be a lot of mistakes, but we're going forward, and we're not going to let them push us back ever, 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 ever.